Otto Warmbier didn't disappear in North Korea. He didn't vanish. He didn't die there. He was kept alive. For 17 months. North Korea preserved his body. Fed him, cleaned him, treated him, while something irreversible happened inside his brain. When they finally sent him back, they didn't send a prisoner. They sent a message. Because whatever destroyed Otto Warmbier didn't look like an accident, didn't look like torture, and didn't happen the way either side claimed. And the most uncomfortable question in this story is not what North Korea did. It's why Otto was still valuable after his life was already over. And once you understand why Otto Warmbier was allowed to survive, the story becomes far more disturbing than his death. This channel examines what power does to people when truth no longer matters. Otto Warmbier was 21, a finance major at the University of Virginia, and the oldest of 3 siblings. He had grown up in a quiet suburb outside Cincinnati, Ohio. Popular, athletic, and ambitious. In high school, he was crowned prom king and homecoming king, known for his charm and drive. He often quoted lines from television shows like The Office, once saying, "I wish there was a way to know you're in the good old days before you've actually left them." In December 2015, Otto decided to spend his winter break on an unusual adventure. He booked a 5-day, 4-night New Year's party tour to Pyongyang, North Korea, a country that had been officially at war with the United States for over 6 decades. The State Department had issued clear travel warnings, advising Americans not to go. Still, Otto wanted to see the world in a different way, to experience history, culture, and places few foreigners ever visited. The tour was organized by Young Pioneer Tours, a travel agency known for taking travelers to destinations most parents would never approve of. For farther than 200, participants received a guided experience of Pyongyang, meals at upscale restaurants, a hotel stay in a 47-story tower with bars, a bowling alley, a sauna, even a revolving restaurant, a combination of luxury and propaganda. Otto arrived in Pyongyang via Beijing on December 29, 2015. From the beginning, he was entering enemy territory. The city itself was filled with reminders of war and ideology. Billboards showed missiles striking the United States. Statues of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il towered above the streets, revered as near sacred figures. Citizens saluted them routinely, their expressions impossible to fully interpret, genuine respect, or enforced loyalty. The North Korean tour guide explained the country's history from the Korean War onward. Between 1950 and 1953, the United States had dropped over 600,000 tons of bombs on North Korea, obliterating major cities and killing an estimated 1 million civilians. The ceasefire in 1953 ended active combat, but no formal peace treaty was signed. To North Koreans, the war never ended. They remembered it. They lived it. And to Americans like Otto, it was almost entirely forgotten, a war hidden in history books. During sightseeing, Otto and the other tourists engaged with the local culture under close supervision. They visited the USS Pueblo, a captured U.S. Navy ship now presented as a monument to past aggression. Guides referred to the United States not as a country, but as the imperial enemy. Otto observed the exhibits with quiet attention. He was aware that a single misstep in North Korea, a photograph taken at the wrong angle, a word spoken incorrectly, could have severe consequences. By New Year's Eve, Otto had joined other travelers for the fireworks display at Kim Il-sung Square. Tourists from Europe, Canada, Australia, and the United States mingled with thousands of North Koreans who had gathered for the celebration. Afterwards, the group returned to the Yanggakdo Hotel, their home base for the trip. The hotel was luxurious, but it was also a tall tower on a small island, tightly controlled, with every exit and movement monitored. That night, some travelers visited the hotel bar. Others went bowling. Otto returned to his room and went to sleep. In those early hours, he was just another young man on vacation, unaware that the smallest actions in this city could carry consequences beyond imagination. 2 days later, as the tour prepared to leave, Otto's passports were checked one last time. The scanning process took unusually long. Then, without warning, he was tapped on the shoulder. 2 North Korean soldiers were behind him. They guided him away from his friends, from his roommate, from the life he had known just days before. Danny Grayton, Otto's roommate, later recounted that he didn't think much of it. He joked, "Well, that's the last we'll ever see of you." And in that moment, Otto Warmbier ceased to be a tourist. He became a detainee. January 1st, 2016. Early morning in Pyongyang. After the New Year's celebrations, Otto had returned to his hotel room in the Yanggakdo Tower. For a few more hours, he was just a student on vacation, unaware of the storm that awaited. But somewhere in the quiet corridors of the hotel, a small act, almost imperceptible, would mark the turning point of his life. According to North Korean authorities, Otto committed a severe crime. He removed a propaganda poster from a staff-only area of the hotel. The poster displayed a slogan praising Kim Jong-il's patriotism. To the regime, this was not vandalism. It was subversion, a direct attack on the unity and morale of the country. Within hours, Otto was detained. Soldiers arrived at the hotel, and he was escorted away in full view of the staff. There was no explanation, no negotiation. His fate was no longer in his hands. 2.5 months later, he would stand trial in Pyongyang's Supreme Court. But in the hours immediately after his arrest, Otto was confronted with a reality that most Americans cannot imagine. He was in a country with no embassy to protect him. He had no lawyer, no advocate, no one to appeal to outside the regime. His actions, as minor as they might have seemed to him, were interpreted as an attack on the state itself. The propaganda machinery moved quickly. CCTV footage captured a shadowy figure, removing the poster from the wall. A timestamp placed the act in the early hours of New Year's Day. North Korean authorities identified that figure as Otto. Witnesses were lined up to testify against him, including his own tour guide. His belongings were presented as evidence. And then came his confession, delivered weeks after his arrest. On camera, Otto admitted to taking the poster. He claimed the act was encouraged by outside forces, a church group, a secret society at his university, and even the U.S. government. Whether coerced or genuine, the confession sealed his fate. To Otto, these months were an endless haze of interrogation, pressure, and fear. He begged for mercy, not by denying his actions, but by taking full responsibility for a crime he may not have fully understood in context. His pleas were formal, ritualized, and ultimately ignored. In North Korea, the trial was swift, less than an hour. There was no opportunity for defense. The sentence, 15 years of hard labor. A young man, who had left his family in Ohio for a winter adventure, was now considered a criminal against the state. For Otto, the world he had known, college classes, sports, family, friends, had collapsed. In its place was a regime where every move was scrutinized, every gesture interpreted as either loyalty or defiance. And while the public world outside awaited news, Otto's family had no way of knowing where he was, what he was enduring, or if he would survive. The first days, weeks, and months were silent. Communications were blocked. The U.S. government had no formal channels. The Swedish embassy, serving as a liaison, encountered only silence. By the end of Act 2, one fact became terrifyingly clear. Otto Warmbier's life had already entered a world where ordinary rules no longer applied. A world where survival depended entirely on forces far beyond his control. After his arrest, Otto Warmbier was no longer a college student. He was a prisoner, alone in a foreign system where every rule, every expectation, and every interaction was controlled by the state. In the days following his detention, Otto was subjected to relentless interrogation. According to GQ reporting and prior detainee accounts, these sessions could last up to 15 hours a day, sometimes with only brief breaks to watch North Korean propaganda films. The goal was not just to extract a confession, but to break the will of the individual, to shape him into a tool that served the regime's narrative. He was isolated from his fellow tourists. He could not speak freely. He could not call his family. His life in Ohio, his parents, his siblings, his friends, existed only as memories. Each question, each accusation, was a reminder that he was utterly powerless. At the same time, Otto was living under constant surveillance. Guards monitored every movement. Cameras captured every gesture. Staff members were required to report anything unusual. There was no privacy, no escape. And yet outwardly, he remained physically unharmed, at least in ways visible to the world. The psychological pressure was compounded by the nature of the charges. He was accused of violating Article 60 of the DPRK Criminal Code, state subversion. To North Korea, his actions weren't a prank, a lapse in judgment, or a naive mistake. They were an attack on the unity and morale of the country. Even a minor infraction could be amplified into a symbol of American hostility. In these first weeks, Otto reportedly began to plead for mercy. He asked for forgiveness from the state, insisting that he had been manipulated, that he had no intent to harm. He invoked his family, his parents, his younger siblings, hoping his humanity might be acknowledged. But in the North Korean legal system, such pleas carried little weight. Confessions, whether coerced or genuine, were the currency that mattered. By mid-January, the pressure intensified. Guards circled, questions repeated, and propaganda continued to play. Days blurred into nights. Otto was forced to repeat the same statements about outside influence. The church, the secret society, even American intelligence, regardless of their truth. In effect, he was becoming a symbol, a living confession designed to validate the regime's narrative. Meanwhile, back home in Ohio, the Warmbiers were unaware of these daily horrors. Attempts at contact were blocked. The U.S. government, constrained by the lack of formal diplomatic channels with North Korea, could do little more than rely on the Swedish embassy. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. By the time his trial approached, Otto had already been psychologically exhausted. Sleep was disrupted. Meals were monitored. His identity as a student, a son, a brother, a human being, was systematically stripped away. The young man who had arrived in Pyongyang on a holiday adventure was being transformed into a political object, a living warning for anyone who might defy the state. Act 3 ends with a chilling realization. Otto's body was alive, but his autonomy was gone. Every word he spoke, every confession he gave, was orchestrated, not for justice, but for control. 2.5 months after his arrest, Otto Warmbier was brought before the Supreme Court of North Korea. The charges violating Article 60 of the DPRK Criminal Code, state subversion. The trial was brief. It lasted less than an hour. There was no room for defense, no independent counsel, and no opportunity for cross-examination. Otto was confronted with evidence, witnesses, and a legal system that operated more as a stage than as a path to justice. Central to the case was CCTV footage. A shadowy figure was seen removing a propaganda poster from a staff-only area of the Yonggakdo Hotel. According to prosecutors, this small act, a poster taken from the wall, represented an attack on the unity of North Korea, and was, in their words, a hostile act against the state. Witnesses were called to testify. The tour guide, an employee, and other staff members described the alleged crime. Otto's own belongings were presented, and fingerprints were shown on a flat screen monitor as evidence. And then came the confession. Weeks earlier, Otto had been recorded admitting to the act. He described it as part of a plan orchestrated by a church group, a secret society at his university, and the U.S. government itself. Whether coerced or genuine, the confession served as the linchpin of the case. For Otto, the courtroom was a cage within a cage. He tried to plead for mercy, to explain his youth, his naivety, his ignorance of the consequences. He invoked his parents, his younger siblings, the life he had left behind. "I beg for forgiveness," he said. "I have made the worst mistake of my life." But in North Korea, words like these were ritual gestures, not defenses. The trial proceeded with precision. The narrative was preordained, and the sentence had already been determined. The law existed not to measure guilt, but to reinforce the power of the state. When the sentence was read, it was 15 years of hard labor. A young American student, who had arrived in Pyongyang on a guided tour, was now officially a criminal against the state. Outside the courtroom, the world remained unaware of Otto's fate. The trial, though public in North Korea, was mostly invisible to international eyes. No consular assistance was available. The Warmbiers, back in Ohio, had no knowledge of the proceedings. Even the Swedish embassy, serving as the official U.S. liaison, faced repeated silence. The trial was more than legal procedure. It was a performative act, a public assertion of control. The message was clear: dissent would be punished, no matter how small, and Americans were not exempt. By the end of Act 4, Otto had crossed a threshold. He was no longer a visitor in a foreign country. He was now a symbol, a bargaining chip, and a prisoner of circumstance. After the trial, Otto Warmbier's sentence of 15 years of hard labor became his new reality. But the world outside, his family, his friends, the American government, remained largely powerless. Contrary to what the sentence suggested, Otto likely never entered the notoriously brutal labor camps that most North Koreans endure. Instead, evidence indicates he stayed in a used guest house in downtown Pyongyang, under constant guard, monitored closely for any sign of dissent or disobedience. North Korea needed him alive, a bargaining chip, and that meant preserving his body, even as his mind and autonomy were under siege. The first weeks of detention were grueling. Interrogations continued, lasting up to 15 hours per day, punctuated only by propaganda films. The objective was clear: break him psychologically, coerce him into repeating the state's narrative, and erode any sense of agency. Otto had no privacy. Every movement was observed, every word recorded. Meals were provided, hygiene maintained, yet the monotony and control created a slow, crushing pressure. Past detainees reported that constant isolation, combined with the knowledge of powerlessness, often led to depression or suicidal thoughts. It's possible Otto was already showing the first signs of hopelessness, begging for mercy, pleading for his life, and repeating the same story of outside manipulation to satisfy his captors. The psychological weight of his situation cannot be overstated. Otto was young, healthy, and unarmed in a country where the government had the power to destroy him in an instant. He was completely reliant on the regime, not just for survival, but for the illusion of survival. Meanwhile, the outside world struggled to intervene. The U.S. government had no formal diplomatic channels with North Korea. The Swedish embassy, serving as liaison, received little to no response. Each day, Otto's family remained in the dark, unaware of his condition, whereabouts, or treatment. The uncertainty amplified the stakes, turning each passing week into a psychological battlefield for both Otto and his loved ones. And yet, Otto persisted. In the eyes of the regime, he had value alive but compliant. Every confession, every repeated statement, every plea for forgiveness reinforced his position as a political tool, a symbol to be wielded in international diplomacy. By the end of Act 5, the tragedy deepens. Otto's body remained alive, but the relentless interrogation, isolation, and psychological strain had begun to take their toll, setting the stage for the irreversible events that would follow. Months into his detention, Otto Warmbier's situation shifted from psychological torment to critical medical crisis. By early 2017, the young American was found unresponsive, a shadow of the vibrant college student who had arrived in Pyongyang just over a year earlier. When news finally reached the world, it came in fragments. North Korea claimed he had contracted botulism, a rare form of food poisoning, after eating a meal of spinach and pork. They said a sleeping pill caused an unexpected reaction, sending him into a state of unresponsive wakefulness. But medical experts in the United States were skeptical. Upon Otto's return, neurologists conducted MRI scans revealing extensive, universal brain damage. This pattern, known as anoxic encephalopathy, occurs when the brain is deprived of oxygen, leading to the death of brain tissue. In simpler terms, Otto had stopped breathing for a period of time, and his brain could not recover. The cause of this oxygen deprivation remains unknown. Several possibilities exist: severe allergic reaction to food or medication, accidental choking or near-drowning drug-induced complications, intentional harm or torture. Though evidence is inconsistent, attempted suicide. As speculated by GQ and other sources, even the North Korean explanation, botulism plus medication, did not align with medical findings. Tests conducted by 3 USC-based neurologists revealed no evidence of active or chronic botulism. The mystery deepened. The exact circumstances of his injury may never be known. Complicating matters further were physical injuries noted by his family and observers. A scar on his right foot, unexplained by medical instrumentation, possible dental trauma. Where the alignment of his lower teeth seemed altered, evidence of extreme malnourishment or neglect was largely absent. His skin and muscle tone suggested he had been physically cared for. The pattern that emerged was chilling. Otto was alive, but vulnerable to catastrophic neurological harm. His captors preserved his body, but the events that led to his unresponsive state occurred behind closed doors. Invisible, unverifiable, and deeply unsettling. For the Warmbiers, the uncertainty was unbearable. They could not confirm whether Otto's condition was the result of intentional abuse, medical error, accidental mishap, or despair-driven self-harm. And the longer the truth remained hidden, the more politically charged his situation became. Otto was no longer just a prisoner. He was a living symbol, his condition a tool for both domestic propaganda and international leverage. By the end of Act 6, the tragedy is fully established. Otto is alive, yet irreversibly harmed. His body is preserved, but his mind and autonomy are gone. The world now watches, powerless, as the young man's life hangs in a fragile and uncertain balance. On June 13, 2017, after 17 months in North Korea, Otto Warmbier was finally returned to American soil. But what arrived was not the young man who had left Cincinnati in good health. Otto was carried off the plane on a stretcher. His head shaved, feeding tube in place, blind, deaf, and unresponsive. He made involuntary, violent movements. A haunting image for anyone witnessing him for the first time. The Warmbiers were devastated. They had prepared for hope, but confronted the reality of a child they no longer recognized. He was immediately transported to the University of Cincinnati Medical Center's Neuroscience Intensive Care Unit. Tests began in earnest: imaging, diagnostics, and monitoring of vital signs. Some systems, breathing, circulation, non-neurological organs, were intact. But his neurological state was catastrophic. Doctors classified him as being in unresponsive wakefulness, previously called a vegetative state. He sometimes blinked. His eyes occasionally opened. But he showed no awareness of his surroundings, no response to verbal commands, and no meaningful communication. Movements of the arms and legs were weak and uncoordinated, rarely purposeful. The Warmbiers remained at his bedside around the clock. Cindy Warmbier described the emotional weight of seeing her son alive, yet gone. "I almost passed out. But I got it together. I did not want him to be alone anymore." For the family, every breath Otto took was a fragile reminder of survival, and every unresponsive glance a heartbreak. In these first hours and days, doctors identified serious complications. He developed a high fever, indicative of stress on his system. The prognosis was grim. Neurologists were clear that Otto would never regain consciousness. The family faced the impossible task of choosing whether to maintain life support or allow nature to take its course. Meanwhile, the world watched from afar. News outlets reported on his return, sparking global media attention, questions about North Korea's role, and debates over what had happened during his captivity. Otto's release, intended as a diplomatic gesture, exposed a shocking truth: his life had been preserved, but in a state that left him effectively trapped in his own body. By the end of Act 7, the tragedy had reached its most visceral stage. Otto was home, but irreversibly altered. The young man who once studied finance and dreamed of the future was now a living symbol of geopolitical maneuvering, coercion, and the human cost of authoritarian control. Once Otto Warmbier arrived at the University of Cincinnati Medical Center, it quickly became clear that his condition was precarious and irreversible. Despite stable vital signs and functioning non-neurological organs, his brain had suffered catastrophic, universal damage. He remained unresponsive, blind, deaf, and unable to move voluntarily, trapped inside his own body. In the days that followed, Otto's health worsened steadily. He developed a high fever of 40 degrees C, signaling the body's stress. Doctors confirmed what his parents feared: he would never regain consciousness. The Warmbiers faced the heart-wrenching reality of choosing how to maintain his life. Every feeding, every breath supported artificially. prolonging a body that could no longer experience the world. Amid this medical crisis, questions about the cause of Otto's injury intensified. North Korea maintained its narrative botulism, followed by a reaction to a sleeping pill. But American neurologists found no evidence of active botulism, and MRI scans showed brain tissue loss consistent with oxygen deprivation, what doctors call anoxic encephalopathy. The pattern suggested respiratory or cardiac arrest, but the precise trigger remained unknown. Physical examinations added further complexity. The Warmbiers noted a scar on his right foot, unexplained by medical procedures, possible rearrangement of lower teeth, suggesting some form of trauma. Overall, Otto's body was in surprisingly good condition for someone who had been bedridden for more than a year. Medical experts debated the possibilities. Intentional harm or torture by North Korean authorities, accidental injury or medical error, attempted suicide during the hopeless weeks after sentencing. Other unknown medical complications. Each theory carried heavy implications. If torture caused the brain injury, Otto's ordeal was a calculated act of cruelty. If accidental or self-inflicted, it underscored the hopelessness and psychological strain of his captivity. For the Warmbiers, the ambiguity was agonizing. Every day was a balancing act between hope and heartbreak, witnessing a son who was alive but unreachable. On June 19, just 6 days after his return, Otto passed away. The news spread across the globe. The bright, healthy young American who had left Ohio over a year earlier had returned home, only to die, his mind lost long before his body. Otto's funeral, held on June 22 in Wyoming, Ohio, drew over 500 people, a testament to the tragedy's resonance. Questions about his treatment in North Korea, the true cause of his brain injury, and the role of political maneuvering dominated national discourse. Yet even amid grief, the story remained disturbingly unresolved. What truly happened during those 17 months? By the end of Act 8, the narrative had reached its most tragic point. Otto Warmbier was dead, but the truth of his suffering remained shrouded in uncertainty. Leaving the world to grapple with the devastating intersection of youth, power, and international politics, Otto Warmbier's ordeal did not end with his death. In many ways, it only became more potent once he was gone. His case was seized by politicians, media, and diplomats, transforming a young American student into a symbol of North Korean cruelty and the stakes of global power. From the moment of his detention, the United States faced a diplomatic blind spot. There is no U.S. embassy in Pyongyang. The Swedish ambassador served as a liaison. But communication was slow, inconsistent, and often ignored. Efforts at back-channel diplomacy stalled, passing from one administration to the next. For the Warmbiers, this meant months of uncertainty, compounded by the lack of transparency from North Korea. After Otto's release and death, the political narrative shifted sharply. President Trump, members of Congress, and human rights advocates framed Otto as a victim of barbarous torture, highlighting his case as evidence of North Korea's disregard for human life. Senators John McCain, Adam Schiff, and Marco Rubio referred to his death as murder, while the Trump administration leveraged his story to strengthen sanctions and justify a hardline stance. In the media, Otto became a cautionary emblem of geopolitical conflict. Newspapers, television programs, and online platforms debated what had happened. Was he tortured or was his injury accidental? Could his death have been prevented with more diplomatic intervention? How much responsibility did North Korea, the U.S. government, and even travel agencies bear? Meanwhile, North Korea deployed Otto as a propaganda tool, even after his death. His detention and televised confession were used to demonstrate the regime's power over foreign intruders. For Pyongyang, Otto was a living, or in some ways symbolic, hostage, a bargaining chip, and a warning to other countries. Otto's story also intersected with the broader nuclear standoff. In 2017, tensions between the U.S. and North Korea reached their peak. North Korea had conducted nuclear tests, launched long-range missiles, and continued a campaign of aggressive rhetoric. Otto, in life and in death, became part of a larger chessboard, where human suffering was leveraged as leverage for political gain. The tragedy of Otto Warmbier, therefore, cannot be measured only in days or medical reports. It exists in the intersection of a young man's misfortune and the machinery of global power. His death, his condition, and even his story were exploited, debated, and weaponized. By the end of Act 9, the audience begins to understand the full weight of Otto's story. It is not merely a personal tragedy, but a case study in how individual lives can be subsumed by politics, propaganda, and international tension. Even after Otto Warmbier's return and death, the truth of what happened to him remained elusive. His condition had become a medical, political, and moral puzzle, one that no single party could definitively solve. North Korea maintained that Otto had contracted botulism from a meal, followed by a reaction to a sleeping pill, which allegedly triggered his unresponsive wakefulness. But U.S. medical experts, including neurologists who examined him immediately upon arrival, found no evidence of active or chronic botulism. MRI scans revealed extensive brain tissue loss across all regions, consistent with anoxic encephalopathy, damage caused by a lack of oxygen to the brain. Yet the cause of the oxygen deprivation remained uncertain. The possibilities, all disturbing, included cardiopulmonary arrest, possibly from a respiratory failure or heart issue, trauma or intentional harm, including alleged torture or other injury accidental events, choking, near drowning, or adverse reaction to medication, psychological distress, potential suicide attempt during captivity. Physical signs added layers of ambiguity. Otto had a scar on his right foot, and his lower teeth appeared displaced, suggesting trauma. But forensic analysis could not confirm whether these injuries were deliberate, accidental, or a result of medical procedures. Medical reports, family testimonies, and prior detainee accounts painted a confusing picture. Some reports suggested Otto had been bedridden in good physical condition, with healthy skin and no pressure sores, contradicting the idea of sustained torture. Other evidence hinted at prolonged, intense interrogation in the first weeks after his sentencing, during which psychological pressure could have led to self-harm or physical decline. Ex-spies and defectors reported rough treatment and battery as standard practice in North Korean detention, but none could confirm exactly what Otto experienced. The result was no definitive answer, only a spectrum of theories, each plausible, none provable, and this uncertainty had real consequences beyond the medical realm. Politically, the narrative could be shaped to suit agendas: torture by a brutal regime, victim of circumstance, or tragic accident. Each interpretation carried weight in U.S., North Korea relations, media coverage, and public perception. By the end of Act 10, the audience confronts the central, haunting question even after exhaustive investigation. What truly destroyed Otto Warmbier? And why was he kept alive for so long if his life was already effectively over? This act sets up Act 11, the final reflection, where we explore the broader implications of Otto's story. For his family, for international politics, and for the human cost of power games, Otto Warmbier's death was more than a personal tragedy. It was a mirror reflecting the brutal mechanics of power. A young man, once full of promise, had become a pawn in a high-stakes game. His life, and ultimately his death, were used to send messages to North Korea's own citizens, to the American government, and to the world. For the Warmbiers, the loss was immediate, devastating, and incomprehensible. Fred and Cindy had welcomed their son home, only to witness a body alive but irreversibly changed, a son who could no longer recognize them, respond to their voices, or experience the world. His siblings lost a brother, a confidant, a role model. The funeral in Wyoming, Ohio, with over 500 mourners, reflected the collective grief of a nation trying to make sense of what had happened. Politically, Otto became a symbol leveraged by both sides. In the U.S., his case was cited as evidence of North Korea's barbarity, shaping public opinion and foreign policy. In North Korea, his televised confession and detention were used to demonstrate the regime's control over foreigners, a propaganda tool to reinforce domestic authority. Yet for all the narratives, one truth remained unsettling and inescapable: the exact circumstances of Otto's injury, the cause of his brain damage, and the choices that led to his death remain unknown. Doctors, investigators, and journalists could piece together evidence, speculate, and theorize. But the core mystery persists, haunting every discussion of his story. Otto Warmbier's life and death also raise profound questions about responsibility, risk, and the vulnerability of ordinary people in the face of global power. How does a college student from Ohio end up caught between nuclear powers and secretive regimes? How do governments, institutions, and organizations navigate moral responsibility when human lives are leveraged as bargaining chips? And perhaps most unsettling, what does it say about a world where truth becomes subordinate to propaganda and strategy? Ultimately, Otto's story is more than a cautionary tale. It is a reminder of the human cost of geopolitics, the fragility of life in hostile systems, and the dangers of a world where one person's tragedy becomes a symbol of power, fear, and control. As the dust settles, the uncomfortable questions remain. Why was Otto allowed to survive for 17 months in a state of unresponsive wakefulness? Why was he returned alive if his life had already been destroyed? And what does it mean when a life, once vibrant and ordinary, becomes a message, a tool, and a symbol, long after the person is gone? The story of Otto Warmbier ends in grief, ambiguity, and reflection, a tragedy that exposes the dark intersections of innocence, power, and political theater.